Welcome to Across Africa, France 24's weekly roundup from across the continent. Coming up, this week we heard from African leaders giving their reactions to the outcome of the US presidential election. Several sent messages to Donald Trump over his win. Some are concerned, others congratulatory. Also, at the COP22 climate conference in Morocco, participants heard that heat waves, hurricanes and floods of the last decade are most likely down to man-made global warming. A report on the impact of extreme weather in 2015 has 4 African countries in the top 10. And anti-slavery campaigners have been targeting the operations of Nigerian people traffickers. Some of the young women who've made the dangerous journey to Europe have made it back and say that the life they found was not worth the risk. Well, this week, Africa, like the rest of the world, learned that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States of America. His victory follows a bitter campaign in which he insulted Hispanics, Muslims and women, but still connected with voters over promises to prioritize domestic issues over international participation or obligations. Although some African leaders are concerned by the prospect of Trump at Washington's helm, others were quick to get on board.
The first African president to congratulate Donald Trump was Burundi's Pierre Nkurunziza. His controversial third mandate began last year and was much criticized by the Obama administration. It had also slammed Congo's decision to postpone its presidential election by 18 months. That might explain why President Joseph Kabila and his allies appeared to welcome Trump's election.
It is not in our tradition to interfere in the choice that other people make. We hope that the Americans, who under the Obama administration got into the bad habit of interfering in our affairs, can do the same. We didn't interfere in their election.
The presidents of Africa's 2 main economies, Nigeria's Muhammadu Buhari and South Africa's Jacob Zuma, also warmly congratulated the American billionaire. The former TV reality star didn't talk about Africa during the campaign, but some countries on the continent, like Burkina Faso, remain optimistic.
He's surrounded by a lot of people. There will be some Africa specialists in his team. We're not worried, because between what you say during a campaign and the reality of being in power, there's always a difference. That's what we're hoping.
One of the few African presidents to express concern was a woman, Liberia's Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Her country has historic ties with Washington. She said she hoped Trump would not put an end to the programs put in place in Africa by the last 2 US presidents, George Bush and Barack Obama.
Trump's presidency may well have a big impact on battles against extremism outside of the US. Under Barack Obama, Africa has become a major front line. Trump's taken a hardline stance on threats, but that doesn't mean his approach to engagement will be more of the same. On Wednesday, I spoke to Jackie Cilia from the Institute of Security Studies in Pretoria.
The biggest concern that I have is that Trump would cut back on particularly U.S. Contribution to the UN's peacekeeping budget. The U.S. Contributes, I think, something like 28% of the roughly $7.8 billion of the UN's annual peacekeeping budget. And if he pays down on that, and we know that he's no friend of the United Nations and has very little interest or knowledge in Africa, it would severely impact upon Africa. There are also the other issues that you mentioned with regard to drone bases, but the general attitude towards countering terrorism, I think, is also a concern.
On that front, bearing in mind that under Bush's administration and his foreign policy, specifically the war in Iraq, that actually played into fanning the flames that led to terror groups like ISIS. Trump has made a big thing about his determination to wipe them out. What are your concerns about how Trump, who's been clear that he's going to possibly be more heavy-handed in his approach, might affect anti-terror efforts across the African continent?
Well, it's widely known that Bush, the disastrous intervention in Iraq, really, in a sense, created ISIS. Barack Obama stepped back from that. But what Obama has done is he's escalated UN drone strikes significantly, sort of a hands-off policy. And Trump is speaking of bringing back waterboarding, not closing Guantanamo Bay, and these type of issues. And this will fuel terrorism. It will fuel the reaction if he starts, for example, going after the families of terrorists, extremists. He's mentioned all of these things, and these are hugely concerning. Terrorism is something you don't fight with violence, with conflict. You try and deal with the roots of the problem without escalating it. And the concern is that he's going to do exactly the opposite.
Trump hasn't exactly been the most consistent in his statements made during the campaign. People often come to expect a certain level of rhetoric. How much do you think that people should be counting on that some of the more outlandish claims that he made would actually be followed through on in terms of foreign policy?
Well, you're right that he will be constrained by the foreign policy constituency and the advisors in Washington, and yes, that will be a constraint. But he's proven some of his ideas with regard to, for example, his attitudes towards America's allies, NATO, towards the UN, and so on, are completely outlandish. And this has shaken confidence, I think, globally. This is the global superpower. He is coming with an axe to existing long-term agreements that the US has with many of its allies, and the way in which the international community expect the US to behave. And this is unsettling. It opens up new cracks in the global architecture at a time when the US and the West generally sees a decline in its power and influence. And when we are looking at support to democratization and good governance in Africa.
Diplomats from over 200 countries started the week in Marrakesh for the opening of the COP22 climate talks. The last 5 years have been the warmest ever on record, and a report on the impact of extreme weather in 2015 has 4 African countries in the top 10. Mozambique's at number 1, Malawi's at number 3, Ghana and Madagascar tie at number 8. Now, climate justice is a big issue at COP22. Poor countries are more exposed to the ravages of intense weather, but have done the least to contribute to global warming. In Senegal, a quarter of the country's mangroves have been lost since the 70s to drought and deforestation.
A patrol in the marine area of Joal in western Senegal. It's a protected area, but conservationists often find scenes like this one.
Someone came here and cut the trees quickly. They took the wood and left.
The hardy mangrove shrubs thrive in salty water. They are home to a very rich biodiversity. Crabs, pelicans and hyenas are among those who live here.
Without the mangroves, there are no oysters, no carp. With no mangroves, many species of crabs, such as fiddler crabs, will disappear. So the mangroves are very, very important. Without them, lots of fish would also disappear.
Reforestation is a priority.
You take this off the tree, and then you plant them like this, and it's done.
Senegal has lost 40% of its mangroves since the 1970s. Reforestation programs began in 2009.
We saw that thanks to reforestation, wildlife and fish began to return. They came into the mangroves where they could grow before going out into the sea.
Mangroves aren't only receding because of people looking for firewood. Several factors are at play: oyster fishing, drought, public works, and, of course, climate change.
Nigerian traffickers are exploiting Europe's migration crisis and moving girls through Libya and then over the Mediterranean to Italy. Some do manage to make it back to their homeland after finding that Europe was not all they'd hoped.
For Gloria, Europe was not the safe haven that she'd hoped for. After a month in Italy using prostitution and illegal work to get by, she decided to return to her homeland, Nigeria. And today, she has no regrets.
Today, I can say I'm successful, I'm okay, I'm happy, though it wasn't easy. So nothing good comes easily. You must struggle.
Human trafficking is a major problem in Nigeria. 22,000 migrants reached Europe via Italy in 2015. Roland heads up an NGO in Benin City, which raises awareness of opportunities and helps migrants return home.
As long as the economic situation remains in a very terrible shape, people will continue to move in search for better opportunities. Unfortunately, many of them will become victims of human trafficking.
Mike was given help to return to Nigeria after he was refused asylum in France. He's now been able to set himself up and open a small shop.
The condition was very difficult. Sometimes when we are in our country, we feel that if we go to zero country, it's more better. But when you arrive there, you discover that it's more difficult than here in Nigeria. So I see the condition to me was very difficult. So I decided to come back to Nigeria.
But it's getting harder for migrants like Mike to go back to their homeland. France recently cut the amount of compensation for immigrants who voluntarily want to return home. Added to that, mafia bosses and social stigma can make the journey all the more difficult.
And finally, we look back at the New York City Marathon, which had its first ever Eritrean victor, who was also the youngest ever winner of the race. 20-year-old Guillaume Gebrselassie belted to victory, coming in ahead of a fellow African champion.
Meet Guillaume Gebrselassie. At just 20 years old, he's the youngest man to ever win the New York Marathon. Gebrselassie beat Kenya's Lucas Rotich, crossing the line in 2 hours, 7 minutes and 51 seconds.
We were helping each other before he drove back. Then after I looked back once, he was a little bit far from me. And I was really a little bit angry with him because we were helping each other. I was thinking that maybe other athletes from behind can catch him.
Born in Eritrea, Gebrselassie started running competitively in 2009. He won the 2015 World Championships in Beijing, China, and placed 4th in the 2016 Olympic Games in Rio. He is also the first athlete from Eritrea to win a major marathon.
Nobody has won any major marathon from Eritrea, and it's just like a championship for me to be the winner in such like a race.
Gebrselassie will take home $100,000 for the win and another $25,000 for running under 2 hours and 8 minutes.
Well, that's it for Across Africa this time. Thanks very much for joining us.